introduction, and I'd like to thank the people who are online to view this presentation, and hopefully have some comments and feedback during the presentation, and we'll try to address a few of them at the end. Sarah has outlined the timeline. What I'm going to try to do is walk through the presentation in 35-40 minutes or so that we have adequate time to field the comments that come in. I assume everyone's seeing my screen. Okay, just a quick overview of the presentation. It's actually in three parts. The first part, I'm going to give you a little quick overview of some of the international projects that I have been involved in, just sort of set the context for talking a little bit about the second part of the presentation, which deals with highlighting some of the water challenges that have emerged from international projects and international experience. And the third part then tries to bring it into perspective in sense of Canadian context, and Canadian water management and water policy in Canada. Basically the three themes I want to leave you with during this presentation is the first one is that exposure to working in or exposure to developing and underdeveloped countries highlights the water management challenges that I believe Canada will be facing in the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years. So this is looking at underdeveloped and developing countries and the challenges they face with water management. It gives you a lens to look at what future water management challenges that Canada may be dealing with, and to question whether the policies and the approaches that we're using today will be adequate to address those challenges. The second theme that I want to leave you with, or thought, is around extreme events. We normally think of extreme events as being sort of nature-driven floods and droughts and that sort of aspect, but there is something else influencing extreme events, and that's sort of the economic, social context. Have a great influence on what an extreme event actually is, more than just the natural occurrence of these extremes, but the economy and the social context of the country itself can have a pretty significant influence on what we consider an extreme event. And the third thought and theme is really not answering what Canada should be doing, but as Canada can do better and be better prepared for some of these water management challenges that I expect that Canada will be facing in the next 20, 30 years, and whether we are prepared today and are laying the foundation to deal with that. So that's really the three themes that I want to tease out of this presentation. So the first part, looking at the international projects and just giving you some overview of the work I've been involved in the areas I've been working in. It's mostly developing and underdeveloped regions of the world. A lot of work in Africa, the Middle East, dealing with the Palestinians, Israelis, and Jordanians. Eastern Europe, which is Poland, Russia, Romania, Ukraine, Russia itself. Southeast Asia, a number of countries in South Asia, being Sri Lanka and important. Southeast Asia, the countries of Vietnam, Cambodia, Myanmar, and Laos itself. Central Asia, these are the stands, the Afghanistan, Tajikistan, Kurdistan, and some of the countries that work in Mexico. And my favorite place, which I just came back from, is I have a sweet little project in the Caribbean in Grenada. So that's always a nice place to go down and do some work in. The funding for these projects is from the international donor community. The prime funders are the World Bank, which is Washington-based, and the Asian Development Bank are the prime funders for the projects that I'm involved in. we have done some work in projects that are African Development Bank funded, USAID funded. Early on in the work, when I started this, it was actually CEDA, Canadian International Development Agency at that time, provided funding for projects in this area related to water management, but they're not in this area, and Canada isn't supporting funding in this particular sector at this particular time. Most of the projects have focused on the hydromet networks themselves, the upgrading, the modernization of hydrometeorological data collection networks, as well as not only the collection of the data, but the management of that data, and moving it to using that data and the information systems to provide early warnings and improvements to forecast systems, both for floods, droughts, severe weather, natural disasters, etc. There has been some of the projects have been involved in transboundary interjurisdictional water management, the Zambezi River, Nile Basin, Mekong itself, some in the RLC area with the Central Asia countries dealing with that. So there has been some perspective on transboundary and interjurisdictional water management type of projects. All these projects have involved training and capacity building, and the capacity building is focused on certainly the training aspect and building skill sets in people, but also capacity building at the institutional level, where you're looking at strengthening the organization, the shape of the organization, and the legal framework that the organization works in. So it gives you some sense of the international projects and in the area that I have been focused in. The next series of slides, I just want to highlight a few of the projects. A project in Sri Lanka, it was a dam safety water resource planning project. It really was focused on the dam safety was a very big part of it. Sri Lanka has a number of dams and reservoirs for energy production, as well as to run their irrigation system. So there was some funding going in to ensure that these dams were brought up to current safety standards, and that the operating systems for opening gates, closing gates, etc. were functioning. And then there was a water resource planning aspect to it. The piece we were doing was upgrading and modernizing the hydromet network to basically support the operation of the dams, to support the water resource planning aspect of it. And it was more than the network, it was also the information system as well. So it was to provide data and information to the various sectors in Sri Lanka. One of the aspects of the project that was quite unique was establishing a pilot groundwater program. It was quite interesting in Sri Lanka, is that up until this time, which was 2010 when the project started, there was actually no formal groundwater program in Sri Lanka. So the project looked at setting up a pilot groundwater program. The photo shows one of the typical observers doing evaporate pan reading. This is a manual system that was existing in the country at the start of the project. A little more on Sri Lanka. What we ended up doing is designed, selected, and installed a network of approximately 120 hydromet sites, all reporting in real time. Implemented a modern data management system with web access, so the real-time data would come in to the system, be processed and available for various sectors and users via the web. It's interesting to note that the actual software that was used was a Canadian product by Aquatics Informatics, known as Aquarius, was the software that was implemented for the information management system. The project updated Sri Lanka's the hydrologic and meteorological people, their forecast and operational models, the forecast models for both flood forecasting, operational flows, as well as models to run scenarios if they made certain releases as to what the implications were downstream and for the reservoir systems. And as I mentioned, established a groundwater program, which has now been expanded in the country. And so groundwater is becoming a much more important factor in their water supply scenarios. The photo just shows typical situation in Sri Lanka and a number of countries. This is where you come down to basically the riverbank and do your bathing during different times of the day. As the different genders do their bathing. Can be washing their clothes as well as washing their dishes as well. This is a pretty typical scene that you run across as you drive around the country during various times of the day. Laos, PDR, People's Democratic Republic, or Laos. The project involved developing a national monitoring strategy for the Department of Meteorology and Hydrology, and then providing technical assistance to implementing elements of that strategy, as well as providing training and capacity building, both training of their staff, as well as looking at changes to the Department of Meteorology and Hydrology as far as their organizational structure. The photo is typical river crossing. It's low water. This is the dry season. I should point out Sri Lanka is quite interesting. It has a monsoon season and a dry season. Part of the island actually has two monsoon seasons, the south and southwestern part of the island, where the north part of the island, the eastern part of the island, only has one monsoon season with a distinct dry season. In Laos, there's typical monsoon climate. You have one monsoon season, which is just starting in the next month or so, and will run to September, October. And then the range of the time it's dry. So this is a typical river in the dry season. This is typical crossings that they have during the dry season. You drive across these fords. Once the flow gets too high to use the ford, you have these ferries that move back and forth. And then when the flows become in flood stages, basically becomes impassable to drive around the country or to use these crossings that any of the rivers that dissect when you're moving from location to location. As well, in Lao PDR, is the program was looking at implementing an early warning system, not only for floods, but also for drought prediction. And of course, from the meteorological side is severe weather, such as windstorms, heavy rain events, typhoons, those type of activities. What was interesting about the project in Laos, not only did we have to do the technical aspect of it, we're involved in testing an early warning strategy that had been developed and the standard operating procedures that had been developed. And it was at the community level, so we had to go into select some pilot villages, communities, and go in and do some awareness training on what an early warning looked like, what you should do, and what actions you should take, and then assessed how effective that strategy and the standard operating procedures were in dealing with response to early warning events. As well, from an institutional strengthening perspective, is the water law in Laos was almost non-existent, so quite a bit of effort went into drafting a water law for Laos. The photo shows a typical village. This is a fairly remote area, but this is typical of the buildings. The buildings are, the bottom are on the stilts, where the family basically spends most of the day during the hot weather underneath, carrying out their daily activities, and they actually live above on the second floor. There's a stairs going up, and the sleeping accommodations is on the second floor. Another project was Central Asia. It was actually focused in Tajikistan and Kurdistan. It was looking at modernizing their hydromet forecast system. The real focus of this project being in the Central Asia area was the RLC and strengthening the regional cooperation, in this case between Tajikistan and Kurdistan, on sharing information, sharing training opportunities, sharing information on the various river courses, and trying to build some cooperation at that level. There was, of course, again, training and capacity building element to it. The photo shows one of the typical terrain that you see. It's a very rugged terrain in these areas, but it's just beautiful area. And the people in the photo are some of the staff and some of the local people working on the project. Another project we worked on was in Afghanistan. It was looking at a water investment plan for Afghanistan. The Asian Development Bank had provided almost $300 million in funding to improve water availability for mostly the agricultural sector in Afghanistan, as well as small dams type of activities for water supply. One of the projects that was implemented while we were there was looking at a refurbishment of a particular irrigation scheme in the northwest part of Afghanistan. There were some successes. You can see the photos in the early phases of refurbishing the irrigation scheme. The top right-hand photo is some of the gabions that were being put in place to stabilize banks and canals. The start of work on one of the irrigation secondary canals for irrigation purposes. And the photo on the bottom left is basically an entrance to one of the main canals after refurbishment, and after a light dusting of snow in the area. And the final project to talk about is Poland. The Polish project was a little different than the previous ones I've talked about. Is more involved in providing technical assistance, design, supervision, guidance, training, capacity building to the projects. For the Polish project, we were actually involved with the implementation. So we were doing the implementation of it. And the work involved upgrading approximately 1,000 stations in their hydromet network, which we had about a year and a half to do, and the training and capacity building to support that network once we left. So in the end, in about 18 months, we actually built and installed about 965 sites that consisted of meteorological sites, climate sites, hydrological sites, and groundwater sites in Poland. So what's a very quick snapshot of some of the projects we worked on. Currently, the projects that I'm involved in is one in Cambodia, and it's improving their national flood forecasting center for both flood forecasts and drought prediction. In Cambodia, floods are actually a benefit, a great benefit, being basically a floodplain of the Mekong. So floods offer lots of benefits. It's just the concept that's used there is living with floods. What's more devastating to Cambodia is droughts themselves, because of the limited access to water that you have during droughts. Another project we just finished was in Zambia, looking at their national network, the national information system, as well as services, hydromet services for the various water user sectors in the country are two additional ones. What's interesting to note about these international investments that are made by the donor community is over the last 20 years is to the expected outcomes that these projects have had. Initially, when I started working in this area, the funding from the donor community was focused on economic development and growth for these underdeveloped, developing countries. So it was really a focus on how to build the economy and how to grow the economy. Then they seemed to start to change a little more into focusing. The donor funds were being focused a little bit more on reducing the potential for conflicts at the country level, so within a country, or at the regional level, looking at improved or shared water opportunities and understanding approaches to managing shared basins. And then the donor community in about 10 years ago started to look at more of focusing their donor money in the sense of reducing risk to the population through poverty reduction and improved health, so that the water investments that were being made had to have an outcome that tied directly to poverty reduction or improved health of people. And the last 3 to 4 years, all the projects that I've worked on have really had a natural disaster type of focus, is reducing the effect or building adaptation strategies to deal with natural disasters, as well as for people, the influence of these natural disasters on people and the economy. But they've also had a very strong climate adaptation theme. So you can see over the 20 years or so I've been involved in this, is that the donor community's thinking has moved from supporting growth and development to dealing a little bit with understanding and resolving some of the conflicts through shared water courses, to moving to more of a sort of a people-focused, the human social element focused to poverty reduction, improved health, as well as the ability to deal with natural disasters and certainly climate adaptation theme. So what's all this mean as we move into sort of part two? Part one was sort of a little bit of the international experience. So what can we take away from this? So when we look at it, I look at it sort of, how has it changed my perspective on, when I talk water management here, I also think of water policy. Is how has it changed my thinking on water management and water policy, not only at the international scale, is what's it mean for Canada, in the sense of, is Canada well positioned, or is positioning themselves to deal with some of these challenges in the future. And there's a number of types of challenges that we see, and I'm just going to highlight them here. Is certainly the first one that's always apparent that comes to mind is the availability of water itself, both in quantity and quality, which is a standard theme that we see. Is that you may have lots of water, but it may be poor quality. You may have limited water because of the natural hydrologic distribution in the region that they're in an arid region or a wet region, or it may be a distribution within the country itself. For example, Sri Lanka has a wet zone and a dry zone, and the dry zone is actually a very, very important zone because it's where the best agricultural land is. So there's a lot of pressure on moving water from the wet zone into the dry zone to support food production. Then there's the water availability. There may be significant quantity and quality of water available, but the demand on that water is very significant, either from an agricultural purpose, industrial needs, or domestic, to be able to supply water to your population, as well as address the ecological needs of the environmental needs of the system to make sure you sustain that environmental health. And of course, if you're into a shared basin, that adds another dimension to the whole question of availability of water. So that's one of the challenges is dealing with is availability of water, but it's not just the magnitude of quantity and quality. It's not only supply side, it's the demand side, and the demand side can be from various sectors, as well as shared basin requirements. The second one is water infrastructure. Most of the developing, underdeveloped countries, the infrastructure that exists is limited for the storage of water during the flood season to deal with the seasonal changes in water availability, as well as infrastructure that's available for energy production, such as hydroelectrical energy, which is important for basically economic development in the country, but it also has a human health perspective as well. And this infrastructure that's there for protection from floods, as well as mitigating droughts. Often this is the water infrastructure that exists in these countries is limited or in need of rehabilitation. The third challenge is moving into the institutional capacity. This is the capacity for having adequate budgets and skilled staff to actually work in the water sphere, as well as having the appropriate legal instruments for that institution to operate under that. What is their mandate? Do they have authorities? Do they have rules and regulations that they have to operate by? A fourth area that's quite interesting to look at is the political demographic setting of the country itself. How effective is the government that's actually in that particular country, in the sense of their ability to be unbiased and not influenced by funding that misdirects funds in the appropriate ways. The governance of the country isn't very open to the ability to deal with economic development, human resource development, social welfare, those sort of aspects. One of the interesting things that's emerged is the influence that urbanization is having on water demand in these countries. It's actually creating, in some countries, a water scarcity because of the high demand with the growth of the urban centers, the very high demand that places on available water resources, as well as the infrastructure to deliver that water. So urbanization is having a pretty significant influence in certain regions on creating water management challenges and water policy challenges. And of course, the last one deals with regional tensions and conflicts that add another dimension to dealing with water management itself. So that's what I'm going to do now, is just walk through some of the findings and my thoughts based on this experience, just to share them with you. Is, as you know, a lot of the work I've done is in the hydromet monitoring program area. And over the years of being involved in hydromet monitoring in these systems is a few of us, our thinking has I think matured in how to look at hydromet programs and monitoring programs. Traditionally, most programs, and actually a lot of the way the projects are structured, are really heavily focused on data networks on the ground and the collection of observations. But as you can see from this diagram, there's a problem with that focus. It's really what the issue you're trying to deal with is a disaster reduction or sustainable development decision, and to get from networks to decisions and actions that deal with disaster reduction and sustainable development is you need all this middle stuff. You need the ability to take the data observations and itself and have a data management system. You need the ability and the tools available to data analysis and modeling. You need to be able to produce services, both basic and specialized services, which assist in this decision and actions, which then support your decision, your disaster reduction and sustainable development. So we tend to use this approach now to looking at hydromet modernization networks. We actually start from what are the decisions and actions that are required for the particular investments being made. what are the specialized services and basic services that are required. And then we move through the network in the sense of, so what are the tools and modeling capabilities need to be there, ensure there's a good data management system. And then finally we get to, well, what are the data points that we need on the ground? There are other sources of information, such as some of the global climate models, global weather prediction models, some of the Earth observing systems. So we're changing how this is being implemented in the developing, underdeveloped world, and not just putting network on the ground, but more focus on how do we have a service delivery model that's going to be sustainable in the sense of the funds that are available and the capacity that's available. So that's one of the things that has emerged. The sort of second theme is this whole concept of not just looking at water management in isolation, but looking at water and its connection to food security, its connection to energy production and energy security, and of course, ensuring a good, healthy, sustainable environment out there. So it's looking at water in that particular context. So water is looked at in supporting food security, supporting energy production and energy production and security, as well as maintaining a certain level of environmental diversity and biodiversity in the country. But it's also looking at within the food sector, the food production sector, is what are the things that can be done to make sure that you use water more effectively, so you can either produce more food or higher value food, both from nutrition and quantity perspective, market perspective, for the same amount of water or less water, same for energy, and what are the basic needs needs in the sense of the environment for supporting your biodiversity at what level, what amount of water. So it's looking at the water linked to food, energy, environment, but it's also looking at water within each of these particular streams of the food production stream, the energy production stream, the biodiversity stream, as to are there things that can be done in those streams that also reduce the demand on water or the effect that their production cycle has. So what this means is not only are the connections are important, but it becomes a more complex system to be working in, and certainly the demand for information increases significantly, as well as the management and policy approaches that you use because of these connections. I put a little reminder at the bottom here for myself is one of the concepts that I've seen for maybe 10 years now in the international community is there's a lot of promotion of the integrated water resource management approach in a lot of the underdeveloped, developing countries. And in my opinion, it really isn't working very well, because it's the way that it's being implemented and being talked about. It's very technically focused. It assumes that there's quite a bit of capacity in the country to do this. It assumes there's people trained in it. It assumes there's money available, and it often misreads the complexity and the governance framework that exists in that country. And what we've been promoting more instead of IWRM, because of this, tends to be this technical focus, more of a watershed stewardship perspective, because it brings the dimension of how people interact and the role people play in decision making in their watershed and understanding their catchment watershed better. So it's a more of a engagement process. The photo shows this is sand mining in one of the rivers. Sand is very important construction material in a lot of these regions. So finding good quality sand is important. From the other theme is the the whole water security agenda is a is an important element to be thinking of water not in just allocation and management, but from a security perspective. And I think Canada has come a long way in looking at water from a security perspective. We're looking at it security from because of the population growth, and we talked about urbanization, also economic development, and those are the demands on it. But then what's going to happen from a climate variability? How is it going to affect the food security chain, the energy production chain, human health, socioeconomic development over it? So there's this theme of water security is important to look at when you're thinking about water management. And of course, the other one, which has come through this, is natural disasters themselves, from a theme that needs to be considered in water management. And that's a reduction of the impact of floods and droughts. And this is always through early warning systems, but it's not only getting the warnings out there, is so that the community itself is aware of what the warnings mean, understand what the correct response should be, and that they're actually prepared. So some of the other theme that's come from this is the institutional challenge. So it's not just technical work. You can build network, you can put systems in place, you can do design networks, build stuff. But in the end, you want to look at it and say, what happens if I come back in 5-10 years' time? What's actually going to be available here? And to deal with that, you need to be looking at the institutional challenge that water management presents. And what you really required, and this is not any certainly rocket science, is a really well-performing institutional platform that's there. And that platform has to ensure that there's people available that are skilled and educated in the workforce. Often, in a number of these countries, there actually is no universities or technical schools that are producing meteorologists, hydrologists, anyone with science background to be able to do this type of work. Transparent recruitment. There needs to be an approach that you're actually hiring people based on their abilities and merit into these institutions. There needs to be experienced technical managers, so people understand the technical aspect of the job they do, but also understand how to manage human resources, both managers and supervisors. There has to be the supportive legal framework within the country for the institutions to operate in. And of course, they have to have the funding to run an organization, as well as political stability. In certain countries, this is a real issue. So the institutional challenges are pretty significant on these projects. And when you look at them and you see all these institutional challenges, you want to ask yourself, so what ones do we have in Canada that we should really be focused on, or we shouldn't forget about the investment that's required in these particular areas to ensure that we have the available and educated workforce in years to come. There are a couple of initiatives that are underway that I just want to draw your attention to. The United Nations 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which was released in 2015. There was actually 17 Sustainable Development Goals in it. It's quite an interesting read. The only Sustainable Development Goal that talks about water is the one that's shown here as Goal 6, and it talks about water management from a perspective of water supply and sanitation perspective. Although there are some targets, there's a number under each of these goals, there's a number of sub-targets that they list. There are targets under the Sustainable Development Goal 6 that sort of point to water management, water policy, and they look at enhanced water availability, improved water quality, reducing water-related risks, protection of ecosystems and biodiversity, and they look at well, the institutional aspect too is local participation and suitable governance framework from a legal regulatory perspective, as well as financing into it. So there's this UN 2030 agenda, which I expect you'll hear. If you haven't heard already, you'll be hearing more and more about it over the years to come. Something to keep track of. I believe because the Sustainable Development Agenda was a little weak on the water theme, a lot of the people involved in water-related activities felt that it was a little weak on it. There has been this push to declare a international decade for action, water for sustainable development, 2018 to 2028. Again, this is out of the United Nations, and a resolution was passed, and that the decade has been designated. And so it's starting to spin up now, and there will be a number of activities under the decade, which are all designed to improve cooperation, partnership, capacity development, with really a focus on water management, water policy development that will support the 2030 agenda for sustainable development. So now let's quickly get to Canada. What's this mean for Canada? Just a few more slides here, and we'll be able to take some questions. Quickly is on this slide. I want to, my perspective, and I think is working quite well and is okay in Canada from Canadian context, is what we're really good at is a shared jurisdictional responsibility and management, and we have a number of institutions that highlight this as the International Joint Commission and all its various boards. For the folks in the prairies, the Prairie Province Water Board is a very well-established, well-working, effective organization for dealing with water on easterly tributaries and rivers in the three prairie provinces. Of course, there's the Mackenzie Agreement. Great Lakes have been around for a while, as well as the St. Lawrence approach. The other thing I think we have in Canada is and I class it as adequate. We have adequate institutional financial resource capacity in the area of water and water-related the water-related sector for both management, policy, operations. I would caution, though, I think it's a little bit lean, and perhaps more effort needs to be put into attracting people into building human resource capacity. So we're going to be the water managers in 20 years from now, 10, 20, 30 years from now, and are they receiving the right training? Are there enough the educational system there to support it? And are we attracting good people into that field of employment? The information and basic hydrologic data, it's okay in Canada. It's accessible, certainly accessible. It's for the most part adequate, and it's very reliable. The quality of the data itself is good. Anyone working with hydrologic data and information is always looking for more. And we have pretty good access to some of the Earth observing systems, and I think we need to take a little more advantage of that. But pretty well, we're not too bad off there. I think Canada and the Canadian context, we're getting much better at engaging a broad range of stakeholders in the watershed level, and have been moving that way for many decades now. Ontario and its conservation authorities, what's happened in Manitoba and Saskatchewan, and the various watershed groups that are being established are all headed in the right direction. I think the areas where we need to be thinking about a little more in Canada tend to be is just our perspective on water, and perhaps the population that's thinking of water is that the belief is that water is not a limiting commodity in Canada, both in quantity and in quality. Somehow we have to do more work on that people understand the implications of it, from the political people to decision makers to the general population, that there are some limits to the quantity of water that's available, and the implications of that quality of that water. There's a perspective in Canada too that technology will address all these future water-related pressures. So technology is the answer, which I think that takes us down the wrong path. Technology has something to offer, but it's not the answer. And our tendency in our planning is to be more dealing with what are the current cycle that we're in, from a wet drought cycle to perhaps the medium term. Saskatchewan has a 25-year plan, I believe, or a plan to 2025 on sort of the water direction. Tends to be medium term. So our view tends to be reactive to planning for the next 5-10 years out. And I think we have to be planning a little longer than that phase. So some of the thinking around what we can do and how my perspective has changed is, and I've talked a little bit in the last slide, is I think we need to be looking at a much longer term implications and thinking more about the extremes, not only the extremes that are generated based on natural cycles, but also the extremes that will be forced upon us because of the social economic demands and development that will be occurring. Just give you a quick example. I don't know if you've been following the issue in Cape Town in South Africa over the last 6-7 months. I've worked in Zambia and worked for a South African firm that was based in Cape Town. And they were actually in water supply for the city of Cape Town, which is about 500,000 people. They figured they were going to run out of water back in about February, early March was their 0 day. And that was pushed off until about mid-April, but this is their dry season. Their dry season was in, and they were hoping. And their solution, it was interesting talking to the people, because their solution was, well, we just hope the rains come earlier to fill up our reservoirs so that we have water supply. If you know Cape Town, it sits right on the ocean. When you talk to them about building desalination plants, there was some move to bring in some small plants to deal with trying to provide some water for domestic purposes over the short term. But we're still looking at the longer term was the rains will satisfy our particular needs. The implication of this is they were down to restrictions of 50 liters per person per day was the amount of water that we could use. It was quite interesting. The chap I worked with from South Africa, when he came up to Zambia, he always filled a suitcase full of his dirty laundry so he could have it laundered in Zambia because of the water restrictions in Cape Town. So this is an example of how significant and the economic, tourism, and social demand or issues that created for Cape Town were pretty significant. But it reflects that the thinking was still pretty short term on how to deal with this. It won't happen again. It's a rare occurrence. They weren't looking at the demands for basically the fruit growing industry is taking water, and the grape industry, as well as the impact it had on tourism. So my message is that we really need to be looking quite a bit more longer term at the implications for water management. We need to invest in training and development of our future water scientists, water managers, and hydrologists. I briefly mentioned that in the last slide, but I think this is critical. It is really important to continue the support for water science, and this involves not only the science side of it, but development of knowledge and the information and data that's required to support that development of knowledge and understanding of the science understanding of water and the various links between water and food, water energy, water environment. Canada needs to invest more in, I believe, water awareness and education. We have to invest more in it and really build this water stewardship ethic in the country. And although we're doing well on our transboundary and shared resources, I think we need to be moving more from just sort of allocation type of model to more of a shared benefits approach in the watershed and in that interjurisdictional. So where's the best place to put in food development or food, growing your food supply in the basin versus energy production, and look at shared benefits approach, and other than just each of the jurisdictions get assigned a certain quantity of water. So concluding thoughts, nothing surprising here based on what I mentioned to you, is Basically, I want to leave with you with some thoughts or have you think a little bit about the current water management approaches. Really need to be looking at, from a water security perspective, handling these extremes that are not only natural but are economically driven. That the timeline that we should be looking at is likely more 30 minimum to 50 years out. Um, and then I think we need to be looking at and exposed to the challenges for water management in some of the underdeveloped developing world, because gives us a real life laboratory as to, yes, there's reasons why they're there, but it actually demonstrates the severity of the issue that you're going to be dealing with, and it'd be better to plan for that and try and manage through that ahead of the time instead of dealing with it right today. So that brings us to the end of the presentation, and there's a number of projects I worked on. Once you finish the project or a long day, there's always a nice little dinner, lots of people, and a couple drinks. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll address any questions or comments at this time.
Thank you very much, Russell. That was extraordinary to watch and witness. We do have one question so far. Do you have any examples for some of the points raised on the Canadian context slide? Who has adequate institutional and human resource capacity? And who is engaging a broad range of stakeholders well? Who is making data accessible, adequate, and reliable?
Yeah, I think the federal government with the provincial governments, from the data accessible with the online web access, the openness of the data, that there's no charges for the data. Um, Canada's doing well there. I just think that we need to be putting more analysis and information up there. From that side of it, I think there's not only the hard data itself, but all the how do we bring the Earth observing systems and the information it produced down to a level that if we look at the watershed stewardship approaches, how do those people in those groups be able to make use of this information and making their decisions? So federally, provincially, with some key hydro sectors and that, and they're really doing a pretty good job in Canada, and they have the right framework in place, the right model in place to, from a data information perspective. But there's always improvements that can be done in it. I really think from that data side is they have to look more at the services end at this time. That's an improvement area that they can do. Provinces, a lot of the provinces have done a pretty good job at having their water strategies at the provincial level. I think they've done an excellent job, done a lot of good work in it. I just wonder a little bit about whether they've tested that in sort of the environment that I'm talking about here, and sort of tested it from the extremes. Have their strategies, are they robust enough to deal with this, or are they dealing with current conditions and short-term projections of economic development? So I think we have a good foundation there, but again, there's areas of improvements is sort of looking at that longer term. The watershed groups is it, it's a big challenge. People think it's simple, but it's really a big challenge. And I admire people who've been working in the watershed approach and this water stewardship approach. If you look in Ontario, the conservation authorities are really the start of that. And they've been, what's that, the 1950s when they started? They've got 70 years of experience, and some of them are doing very well. They're working, but it's been a long learning curve to be able to become effective there. Manitoba and Saskatchewan, we're more familiar with, is putting in water stewardship groups. Some of them tend to be more responsive to just looking at what's the issue I'm dealing with today and how to plan for that issue. So there's somehow we have to help the watershed stewardship groups think about not only the issues that they're faced with immediately, but what will be the issues that they're going to be faced with in 5, 10, 20 years time. So the decisions they're making today won't worsen those type of conditions. So I hope that helps a little bit.
Oh, thank you. Another question. Are you aware of any best practices in watershed governance internationally involving multiple jurisdictions which could inform watershed management in Canada? For example, are there watershed councils or other bodies?
To be quite frank, is I see a lot of academic discussions around how to set, but I have not seen one that's worked very effectively. It's, as I say, it's a very complex area to work in, not only from a technical perspective and just setting up an organizational structure. It's the capacity, the institutions that exist outside of that. But Europe, I understand, has some very well performing sort of institutional structures that are dealing with shared basins as well, which tend to work very well. But you've got to look at the European context. There's quite a bit of capacity there. They're a small area. They have quite a bit of financing behind them. The overall governance system in the countries are fairly stable and democratic in their approach to engagement. So if you look at it works there, then you have to have all these pieces in place when you go into a underdeveloped type of country to make those things work, and that's a real challenge. Most often, very little of that is in place, but the expectations are usually placed on these countries that this is going to be the solution to their water problems.
Okay. We'll just give people a couple more minutes to add any other questions that they may have. I had one question. You talked about donors are shifting their focus from just water quality to more socioeconomics and risk reduction. Do you find the governments are following suit, or is it more led by the governments wanting to focus more on risk reduction?
Well, the governments have the issue to deal with it. The donor community in some way brings their own agenda to these countries as well as the way they're funded. I should step back. The way they're funded, these projects are funded, there's always two types of funding. There's a grant to the country and there's a loan to the country. So the grant from the donor community basically is non-repayable. It's money to them, and usually the donor has quite a bit of influence in how the project's delivered. And to be very open, is the donor community or other countries finance this, and they have a political agenda in the background too. It's not all, it's certainly the goodness business too in it, but it's also there's some political agenda. Small p political agenda is a reason for supporting certain countries in the sense of moving their governance system in a certain direction, ensuring that environmental standards are put in place so that if you're going to compete against them for production of something, that they have the same environmental foundation that you have in the Western world and European world, for example, that you have to produce goods and services too. So there's that aspect of it. So the donor community is always really trying to look out future as to what are the issues we're trying to deal with, and certainly this general development agenda is going to lead some of that, and look at trying to bring these countries, the underdeveloped development countries, just to progress them along in these particular areas and help them. Not to say the governments don't recognize they have issues and problems, and they have to petition the donor community to provide support. So it's the donor community really has a significant influence in driving some of this. But the countries have to accept it as well.
Okay. Thank you very much. Doesn't look like there's any other questions. I'm sure that there will be some follow-up after the presentation here. I did record it today, so